Hello students, welcome to Unit 13, Personality. In Unit 13, we will be discussing all the many different perspectives that help us understand where our personality comes from, what shapes and molds our personality, and how does it develop, so that we can better know ourselves and better understand others as well. So first, what is personality? Personality is the psychological qualities that bring a consistency to an individual's thoughts and behaviors in different situations and at different times. Personality is a continuously changing process shaped by our individual needs and cognitions and by external pressures from the social environment. It is the thread that consistently runs through our lives. So here are just a few minor examples of personality traits. In layman's terms, you might have heard Type A and Type B personalities. While these might not be technical terminology, these personality types, if you will, are more popular in just average, common vernacular. So what are they? Type A personality is characteristic of time pressure. This person is easily angered. They're very competitive and ambitious. They're hard workers and they play hard. All right, they're more prone to heart disease than the rest of the population because they are so gung-ho all the time and so easy to anger and very intense. Just Type A personality are just a real intense type of personality. Whereas Type B personality is more characteristic of this individual here. Very relaxed, very easygoing. But some people can fit both Type A and Type B depending on the situation. What do you think kind of personality Mr. Stansel has on average? So that was just personality and just Type A and Type B personality in general. But in 13.1, we're going to be focusing on the psychoanalytic perspective of personality. So with that in mind, pop quiz, who is the father of modern psychiatry? This person also made groundbreaking discoveries in the psychoanalytic perspective. That person is Sigmund Freud. If you said Sigmund Freud, you are correct. Although there are a variety of psychodynamic theories, they originate with Freud's psychoanalytic theory. And we're going to explain the difference between psychoanalytic and psychodynamic at the end of this video. However, in this theory, Freud said the unconscious, which is the hidden parts of the mind, was a source of powerful impulses, instincts, motives, and conflicts that energize personality. Freud's psychoanalytic theory developed in the early 1900s and grew out of his work with his neurotic patients. These are patients who suffered from psychological disorders. Freud used the term dynamic to refer to mental energy force. So psychodynamics, right? It emphasizes the importance of early childhood experiences, unconscious or repressed thoughts that we can't voluntarily access, and the conflicts between conscious and unconscious forces that influence our feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. Psychoanalysis focuses on how the mind's energy is exchanged, transformed, and expressed. The mental stream, quote-unquote, of the sex drive was called the eros, the Greek god for passionate love. The energy behind this drive was called libido, Latin for lust. The quote-unquote mental stream for destruction was thanatos. Freud called it the death instinct that drives aggressive and destructive acts humans commit against each other. So in this unit, we're going to be talking a lot about unconsciousness. So what is the unconscious? According to Freud, it's a reservoir of mostly unacceptable thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories. The individual is not consciously aware of these states. So, for example, if we applied this to our last unit of motivation and emotion, an unconscious motivation is a Freudian concept that refers to the influence of repressed thoughts, desires, or impulses on our conscious thoughts and behaviors. Freud developed 3 methods to uncover unconscious processes. They were free association, dream interpretation, and slips of the tongue, known as Freudian slips. Free association is when one talks about any thoughts or images that enter their head. It's the assumption is that this kind of free-flowing, uncensored talking will provide clues to the unconscious material. So if you just sit in your room and just start saying the first words that come to mind or describing the first images that come to mind, Freud hypothesized that these spur-of-the-moment words and images would underlie some type of repressed memory or repressed drive. Whereas in reality, it's probably just the result of availability heuristics. According to Freud, our dreams were the highway or the main road to the unconscious mind. So dream interpretation is a Freudian technique of analyzing dreams, and it's based on the assumption that dreams contain underlying hidden meanings and symbols that provide clues to unconscious thoughts and desires. That is, they contain latent content for the manifest content of the actual dream. Freud distinguished between the dream's obvious story or plot, called manifest content, and the dream's hidden or disguised meaning or symbols, called latent content, which we've discussed before. And the third technique to discover the unconsciousness is the Freudian slips. These are mistakes or slip of the tongue that we make in everyday speech. Such mistakes, which are often embarrassing, are thought to reflect unconscious thoughts or wishes. Now, as we know, this is not the case. When we slip up or say something incorrectly, it's not because of some repressed memory. It's because that the neural communication for the word we're trying to say might accidentally stimulate an adjacent neuron, which would cause us to say the wrong word. Either that, or we're just tired or anxious or stressed, and it's a slip of the tongue. So those were techniques in how Freud studied the unconscious mind. Now we're going to go into how the unconscious is structured and how it underlies our personality structure. You might not realize it, but you've seen Freud's personality structure before. Have you ever seen a cartoon where an angel is on one shoulder and there's a little devil on the other shoulder, and they're trying to convince the person to take one course of action over the other? Well, that's Freud's personality structure. That angel is called the superego, the little devil is called the id, and you, the person, is the ego. So to understand how the id, ego, and superego interact, imagine an iceberg floating in the sea. The part of the iceberg that is above water represents conscious force, of which we are aware, while parts below the water indicate unconscious force, of which we are not aware. Notice that the parts of the superego and the ego are a part of our conscious awareness, whereas the id is completely submerged into the unconscious unknown. In Freud's personality model, the id is the primitive unconscious reservoir that houses the basic motives, drives, and instinctive desires that determine our personalities. It always acts on impulse and seeks immediate pleasure or immediate gratification, the only part of the personality present at birth. All right, so it's a biological drives and sex and aggression. It's a source of all mental energy, according to Freud. The id follows the pleasure principle, which is to satisfy the drives and avoid pain, without concern for moral restrictions or society's regulations. Now, as we said, the id is the most basic part of our personality structure that we are born with. And from the id, we eventually develop our ego. The ego it regulates the conflict between the id and the superego, and is the job of the ego is the rational part of the mind. The ego must figure out a way to satisfy one's desires while not violating one's moral code. When this balance becomes upset, conflicted thoughts and behaviors that signify a mental disorder may be the result. The ego follows the reality principle, which is to satisfy a wish or desire only if there is a socially acceptable outlet available. As we pointed out in the previous slide, the ego is aware of conscious stimulation. So the ego can take our unconscious impulses and apply them to social norms. And from the ego that we develop from the ego, which develops from the id early on in life, will then enable us to develop the superego as young children. The superego is the police of personality. and is responsible for morals and values learned from society. The superego develops as the child forms an internal set of rules based on external experiences. The inner voice of shoulds and should-nots is characteristic of the superego. Often conflicts with the id. The superego often conflicts with the id because the id wants what feels good and the superego wants what is right and moral. The superego develops from the ego during early childhood. You might recognize characteristics of the superego from the Disney movie Pinocchio with let your conscience be your guide. And then here's that example again. There's the ego, there's the id, and then the superego is our moral compass, according to Freud. So there have been many disagreements on this psychodynamic theory, but Freud believed that oftentimes there is little to no disagreement between the goals of the id and the superego. However, when disagreements occur between the id and superego, Freud theorized that the ego works to find compromises between the goals of the id and superego. This compromise is found by the ego using what Freud described as mental processes or defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are Freudian processes that operate at unconscious levels and that use self-deception or untrue explanations to protect the ego from being overwhelmed by anxiety. Remember, anxiety is an uncomfortable feeling that results from inner conflicts between the primitive desires of the id and the moral goals of the superego. So ego defense is the largely unconscious mental strategy to reduce anxiety or conflict. We're about to discuss the 8 defense mechanisms that the ego uses to make a decision between the id and the superego. And now the basic underlying factor with all these defense mechanisms is called repression. In repression, the ego defense that excludes unacceptable or inappropriate thoughts and feelings from our awareness. It removes anxiety-arousing stimulation from our awareness, so as to create cognitive harmony. So the first type of defense mechanism or repression is called regression. So according to regression, in the face of anxiety, you act like a child. So for example, imagine a female teenager gets pulled over by the police for speeding. What is that teenage female going to do to get out of that ticket? She's going to start crying like a little baby, and odds are she'll probably get out of the ticket. That's an example of the defense mechanism regression, because they regress back to a more immature state. Projection is the defense mechanism where one falsely and unconsciously attributes their own unacceptable feelings, traits, or thoughts to individuals or other objects. And reaction formation involves substituting behaviors, thoughts, or feelings that are the direct opposite of unacceptable ones that you may hold. Rationalization involves covering up the true reasons for actions, thoughts, or feelings by making up excuses and incorrect explanations. Displacement involves transferring feelings about or response to an object that causes anxiety to another person or object that is less threatening. The defense mechanism of sublimation is the channeling of one's frustrations toward a different goal, sometimes a healthy defense mechanism. We might call it cathartic moments. The defense mechanism of denial is refusing to recognize some anxiety-provoking event or piece of information that is clear to others. This one's probably the most self-explanatory out of all the defense mechanisms. Take note that all these defense mechanisms function indirectly and unconsciously. They reduce anxiety by disguising our threatening impulses. Just as the body unconsciously defends itself against disease, so also, believed Freud, does the ego unconsciously defend itself against anxiety.